Thank you. Firstly, I wish to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered and head into banking on climate chaos. So I'm Maurice Farrell. I work at ANZ. I'm also a founding member of the union's Human Rights Network. So the network we launched in 2021, our aim is to hold financial institutions to account on a range of important issues and around the obligations that corporations have to observe the rights of workers and communities they serve. When we launched, we said that we would stand together for a finance sector that respects and promotes human rights in every interaction at every opportunity. And since then, we've considered issues where we have seen human rights obligations tested and violated, such as our support for working people in Myanmar. And in particular, bank workers have been killed, gone into hiding, or who've lost their jobs because of the coup. The network, we called on the ANZ Bank to withdraw operations from Myanmar. Now, at the time, ANZ did not move. Instead, they called us dangerous justice warriors, which it's a badge of honour. It was interesting to see a CEO flounder when questioned on that. So it really was working together with other NGOs. We were able to chip away. And so the good news is that the bank, it caved into pressure and it announced late last year that they're pulling out of Myanmar. So this type of campaigning works. And unfortunately, it also exposed that ANZ, it did have dealings with a local bank which had ties to the junta. So it's a powerful example of the role that we can play in holding our employers to account on their human rights obligations. So that's inspiring. But in this session, what we're asking you to consider, based on, from our perspective, the Human Rights Network, we know that campaigning on the global issues that are also local, we know that that matters. And so what we're asking you to consider in this session, the climate crisis. What role should we take as the union that represents bank workers? And it's an important question for us to ask. Fossil fuels, they're not extracted from the earth without money. Money makes this happen. Pipelines, they don't get built without money. If an industry is destructive, dirty energy, that doesn't grow or continue without funding. And banks are financing the climate crisis. Our big four banks, they've poured $47 billion over 7 years into fossil fuel industries. Fossil finance is climate damage. Year after year, banks have ignored the devastating impacts of increasing funding for dirty energy. Banks continue to finance companies across fossil fuel industries and with very little regard to the lived consequences that consequences on the planet and the people, us, that live in there. Communities across Australia and around the globe, we're facing devastating effects of climate change. You could point to examples like bushfires, droughts, floods. Indigenous peoples are often disproportionately on the front lines of those impacts. And they're also disproportionately having to take up resistance to the impacts of climate change and fossil fuel extraction and the infrastructure that takes the fossil fuel out of the ground. And to address the cause of climate change, we protect people from the impacts of this change. That should be a natural assumption. We know that we must stop fossil fuels from being extracted and burned and keep our forests intact. The funding is what allows that to happen. So we know that it starts with banks. Together, we're going to hear from, sorry, I'm just reading a script here. Alex, April Merleaux, Kyle Robertson, Danai Bosler. What we're going to hear from right now is April Merleaux, Research Manager with Rainforest Action Network. Dr. Merleaux will provide a global perspective on what the biggest 60 banks are doing in terms of their lending across fossil fuel industries. Due to time zones, this is a pre-recorded presentation, and we're going to bring the issue much closer to home. We're then going to get some local intel from Kyle Robertson from Market Forces. That's the Australian Banks campaigner and researcher with Market Forces. And to round the session, Danai Bosler, Chief of Staff with the Victorian Trades Council and who runs the Climate Action Network. Danai will share her thoughts on climate through a trade union lens and outlines what are some of the ways we can step up as climate justice campaigners.
I just wanted to just give a quick intro before we watched Dr. Merleaux. As Maura said, because of the time zones, we couldn't have her zooming in live. So she really just wanted to pass on her apologies. RAN has been publishing this particular report, Banking on Climate Chaos, for the last 13 years. It's a really comprehensive body of research. We've included it in the pre-reading. I hope you had a chance to have a look at it. I think what you're going to find from this is that the numbers and the data is just mind-blowing. And whilst, as Maura said, it talks to the top 60 banks, our big four are included in that. It does have a slightly North American focus because that's where the worst of the 60 are. But I want you to stay with it because she's going to take us through some really important kind of concepts. And then, like Maura said, we're going to bring it right back to our own backyard. And then Kyle's going to explain, well, what's actually going on here, having heard what we can kind of get from this big kind of international perspective. So with that, let's watch the clip and then we'll come to our panel.
Project, we work with 6 other organizations, global organizations, to produce this report. It's a huge undertaking that we've done annually in some form or another for the last 14 years. So a few kind of top line things to say about the report before I dig in and give you some details about the findings. So the first thing is that this is the most comprehensive analysis of private bank financing for fossil fuel companies. We cover 60 banks, the biggest banks globally by assets. We've got 7 authoring organizations. This year, we have more than 600 endorsing organizations from 75 countries. We feature tables that highlight bank financing for all fossil fuels and then several spotlight sectors. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We include policy assessments to evaluate the policies that banks have set for themselves and hold them accountable. And we have online interactive data. In addition, we feature frontline stories from groups that are on the front lines of fossil fuel build out, fighting the really dangerous projects of extraction and expansion that we see globally. A couple new things this year we're really excited about include documentation of financing for companies expanding in the Amazon biome. We've got new frontline stories. We've got an extended essay on the build out of global build out of liquefied natural gas, which you'll hear about a little bit more later from my colleague Bruce. We've got an assessment of the net zero targets that banks have set. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And we analyze financing for more than 3,000 fossil fuel companies. So the big takeaway here is that since the Paris Agreement went into effect in 2016, the 60 biggest banks have put $5.5 trillion into fossil fuels. So 7 years, $5.5 trillion into fossil fuels. And every dollar of that is driving climate chaos and causing deadly local community impacts for the frontline communities that are most impacted both by climate chaos and by the extraction. Slide, yeah. So I'm going to just say a few quick things about our methodology and what we do and don't include in the report. So the most important thing to say is that we cover in this report lending and underwriting activities by the bank. So when they issue a loan, when they participate in issuing a bond or supporting the issuing shares, that's what we count. We don't count their investments. So the actual, if they themselves, and many of these banks do hold on to assets as investors and as asset managers, we don't look at that. So what we are looking at, that $5.5 trillion is actually even just a slice of the support that banks provide to fossil fuel companies. So that's something to keep in mind, is that we're just, even as big as it seems, it's still just a small piece of what we're looking at. Next slide. In addition to that big top line number, the $5.5 trillion in lending and underwriting, I can tell you a couple of the key takeaways from this year's report. So for the first time since 2019, when we started measuring all fossil fuels, a bank besides JP Morgan Chase ranks #1 as the worst financier of fossil fuels, and that's the Royal Bank of Canada, or RBC. JP Morgan Chase is still overall the worst bank since the Paris Agreement, having financed $434 billion to these fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement went into effect in 2016. But RBC and Canadian banks as a whole have been increasing their financing for fossil fuels and increasing their share of the overall table. So RBC provided $41 billion to fossil fuel companies in 2022, making for a total of $253 billion. Next slide. So the broader frame of this report is in part, of course, to share this data, to share these finance numbers and to share it in ways that are useful for campaigners and for advocates and just for people who are trying to understand where their banks are putting their money. The broader context is that this is all framed through the lens of Indigenous people's sovereignty and thinking about centering the voices of those who are on the front lines that are most directly impacted by fossil fuel build out and by the challenges of climate change. And we really see the framework of keeping it in the ground, right? Ending the extraction of fossil fuels and shifting towards a people-centered energy system as the core idea motivating this report. So we have a lengthy essay in this report from our partner, the Indigenous Environmental Network, that really highlights some of the false solutions that banks and other advocates are putting forward and reiterates the idea that keeping fossil fuels in the ground is the way to address simultaneously the crisis of human rights and the crisis of climate. Next slide. So the largest banks, the largest financiers of fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement are JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, RBC, MUFG, which is a major Japanese bank. So there are 3 major Japanese banks that are in our list. 2 of them are in this top 12 list. And you'll notice about this list that US and Canadian banks dominate the list. We've got 1 British bank and 1 French bank and 1 Japanese bank, and otherwise we're looking at North American banks leading the way in the financing for fossil fuels. So those of you who are located in Canada or the United States, those really, I think, a call to action for those of us living in those places. Next slide. So in addition to all fossil fuels, we track financing for companies that are operating in each of these particular sectors of the fossil fuel industry. So we look at financing for offshore oil and gas, Arctic oil and gas, fracked oil and gas, Amazon oil and gas exploration, coal power, coal mining, liquefied natural gas, tar sands oil, right? So we look at each of those separately and we adjust the transactions to reflect the percentage of the company's business that is in each of those sectors. So it gives us a little bit more fine-grained look at what the banks are doing and another tool to hold them accountable. Next slide. So I wanted to return to this slide for just a minute because you might notice what looks like a little bit of a drop in 2022 in the total financing that banks provided to fossil fuel companies. And I wanted to just take a minute to explain what I think is going on there, because it doesn't actually make me feel particularly hopeful. I suspect that it's not the beginning of a long-term trend. The way that I've been describing it is that there was a slight drop in financing in 2020 for reasons that I think we're all familiar with, having to do with the COVID health crisis and a number of other kind of economic disruptions. There was a rebound in financing in 2021. And what I see happening in 2022 is a little bit more of a leveling out. And there are a couple of reasons why I think that happened. And the overall message is that it's not attributable to policies that the banks made. In other words, banks didn't make a proactive decision to stop financing fossil fuels last year, but instead broader market forces brought that number down a little bit. And I anticipate that it will go up again this year. Next slide. So the first factor contributing to that slight drop is just record fossil fuel profits, right? So I love this headline from The Guardian that refers to it as monster profits for energy giants. So we see, just following on years of either not particularly profitable years or actually years with losses, we see record profits in 2022. And that is, of course, having to do with the conflict in the Ukraine, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and disruptions to the global energy markets as a result of that. So those profits really are, I think in many ways, and some of the banks seem to agree with us about this, that those profits are driving the decisions the fossil fuel companies are making about how much they're going to borrow. They have cash on hand, so they're using that cash to finance their activities, to finance their expansion. And I suspect that this year, as the profits are not going to be as great this year, they're going to come back to the banks asking to borrow money again. Next slide. So we document this in a couple of ways in the report. One way is just looking at some of the really, really high profits from a couple of the fossil fuel companies that historically have been really big customers of the banks in our report. So the first example here is Occidental Petroleum Company, which made an increase of 721% in their profits between 21 and 22. So huge increase in profits from 21 to 22. And they have typically borrowed about $11 billion per year. Yes, they've borrowed a pretty huge amount every year and then borrowed nothing last year, right? So, and that we have a long list of these companies that have just record profits last year and didn't, as a result of that, didn't borrow anything. We also see some of these companies rolling back the already weak climate commitments that they had made. So this is just generally, I think, not great news. Next slide. Yeah, and we can skip over this because this is just a sort of bigger picture. So the second factor that I think contributed to the slight decrease in financing that banks provided to fossil fuels actually has to do with what the oil and gas industry themselves are doing. So this chart is in our report, and it draws on data analysis done by Oil Change International, another partnering organization that co-authors this report. So they created this chart using data from Rystad Energy, which is the industry database that tracks investments in a whole range of different kinds of oil and gas projects, and makes estimates about where production is going, where investments are going. So according to Rystad Energy, the amount of oil and gas that will be approved for development decreased in 2022 from 2021, and to the next to 2020, it's the lowest level since the Paris Agreement went into effect. And so because of that decrease, that estimated decrease in 2022, it stands to reason that bank financing for fossil fuel companies also might have decreased, because the bank financing tends to mirror the activity in the sector. By that same logic, they're estimating that the oil and gas reserves approved for development are going to increase by 2024 to the all-time high since 2015. So in terms of billions of barrels of oil equivalent that is going to come to a final investment decision, we're looking at a pretty dramatic increase over the next couple of years. And I'm anticipating that we're going to see an increase in bank financing for fossil fuels that parallels that. Next slide. In addition to looking at the finance data, we also do an analysis of bank policies. So we look at that banks make a couple of different kinds of policies in order to set the direction of travel for their fossil fuel financing. So one kind of policies are the kind that we call exclusion policies, where they say they're going to exclude financing for particular sectors. And we see a growing number of banks making policies like that for particularly dirty and difficult sectors like coal, for example. Unfortunately, for that kind of policy, we see many, many loopholes. And so it comes away seeming like more like greenwash than actual intention to be making a change in their business as usual. The other kind of policies that we see banks setting increasingly are net zero targets. So that means that they are announcing that they will align their financing with a global goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions, usually by 2050. Sometimes they have a slightly different time frame for that. Often we see that those targets are just not very strong. They've got lots of loopholes in them. They rely on untested, unproven technologies, rely on offsets that we know have a lot of problems, including human rights violations. So we don't have a whole lot of confidence in those net zero targets based on the analysis we did this year. Next slide. So just to give an example of one of the kinds of loopholes, one distinction that many of these policies make is that they apply only to a particular kind of financing, which is called project finance. So that's where the bank and the company that's seeking financing will structure a particular kind of deal that that's financing a specific project. Unfortunately, and most of the bank's policies apply just to project finance. So they say if a company comes to us, let's just say ConocoPhillips, for example, if ConocoPhillips comes to us and says, we want to finance the Willow project, which is extracting oil from the Arctic, many of the banks in our report, not all of them, but many of them will say, no, we're not going to finance that project because it's in the Arctic and we are not financing projects in the Arctic. That kind of finance, project finance, only makes up 4% of the financing we see in our data set. The vast majority of financing we see is designated for general corporate purposes. So to use the ConocoPhillips example again, if ConocoPhillips goes to the bank and says, we would like to have a loan for general corporate purposes, just to carry on our business, that activity is not covered by most banks' Arctic policies. So in fact, what we saw last year, that ConocoPhillips, which is developing the Willow project that recently was approved by the Biden administration, ConocoPhillips got financing from the banks in our report last year, designated for general corporate purposes. And the banks say to us, well, we can't really tell exactly what they're going to do. We don't know for sure that that money is going to go to that particular project. And so we can't really exclude financing. But that's a huge loophole that really enables companies like ConocoPhillips to keep developing these really dangerous projects that are going to release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Next slide. So in addition, we looked at the net zero commitments that the banks made. So their pledges to reach net zero for their own operations and also for to hold their clients accountable to reaching net zero by 2050. So 49 banks in the scope of the report made commitments like that. Just to showcase the ways that those commitments seem like they really lack, like they're just not that credible. $122 billion from those 49 banks went to the top 100 companies financing fossil fuel expansion in 2022. So we tracked $150 billion total that went to those 100 companies. 122 billion of that came from banks with net zero commitments. And even Antonio Guterres, who is the head of the UN, says that these bogus net zero pledges cover up, are being used to cover up massive fossil fuel expansion. And he calls on companies to stop using them as greenwash.
All right. So we've heard from Dr. Merleaux. Now, they're pretty shocking data sets there. And that shows just how much of the world's biggest banks, how much they're loaning to destructive industries. So what we're going to do now is we're going to head closer to home. We're going to have a look at what our local banks are doing. Now, last week, Market Forces launched a report on the big four banks. So the report's titled Banking Climate Failure. Now, that was listed in your pre-reading But yeah, tell us a little bit about market forces.
Thanks, Morris. Thanks, everybody, for having me here. I'm really excited to be speaking at the FSU's National Congress today. I know you've had some really great speakers come over the years, including our current Prime Minister. So I'm thrilled to be able to have a chance to talk to you about a topic that's very close to my heart and should be close to all of our hearts, which is the ongoing fight for climate justice, the ongoing fight for First Nations justice, and intrinsically linked to that is the ongoing fight for social justice, which includes workers' rights as well. So it's all interconnected. I'm keen to tell you a story about that today. I'll start off by introducing myself. My name's Kyle. I'm the Australian Banks campaigner and researcher at Market Forces. I'm also a proud ASU delegate. We have many ASU members at Market Forces who are proud to be ASU members as well. In regards to Market Forces, our journey started back in January 2013. We just had our 10th birthday in February this year. Back when Market Forces started, it was more or less just an idea in our founder's head about how to expose the finance sector's financing of environmentally destructive activities, provide that information to the public, and start to build some pressure on them to change them. And we've had a lot of success since then. We've rapidly scaled up our operations. We've rapidly scaled up our ambition. And we've gotten to a point today where we're a really well-regarded research organization. And we've done a lot of work empowering shareholders as well, which I'll also touch on in just a little bit. So a big part of the work that we do is that financial sector reporting tends to be quite opaque. You can find out maybe what a bank's fossil fuel exposure is, but a bank's never going to tell you that they're financing fossil fuel expansion when they're committed to net zero emissions by 2050 and the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's the work that we try and do at Market Forces with our research, is we try to let the public know exactly where the money is going, to which companies it's going to, what those companies are up to, and what the impacts of those companies will be, and how they're enabled to do so by the biggest financial institutions in the country. So most recently, we've released reports this year, our Climate Wreckers Index on the super funds, which talks about super funds investment in the 180 biggest climate wrecking companies in the world who have the most aggressive expansion plans. And like Morris just said, we released Banking Climate Failure last week on the bank's financing of the fossil fuel industry in the last 2 years, and also since the signing of the Paris Agreement in 2015. So a big part of the work that we're really proud of at Market Forces is the shareholder action work that we do. For those of you unfamiliar with that, basically, ever since we've started Market Forces, we really wanted to make climate change and climate risk mainstream conversation in corporate boardrooms. We wanted it to be something that the CEOs of our ASX listed companies are constantly thinking about, constantly discussing, constantly thinking about their role in making the problem worse and how they can actually make the problem better given the resources that they have. We do that in a few ways. We engage with these companies a lot of the time, and when engagement isn't producing any fruitful results, generally we'll mobilize shareholders. Key way we do that is taking shareholder resolutions to ASX listed companies, including the big four banks. For instance, last year we put forward a shareholder resolution to all the big four banks, asking them to show their shareholders how their financing won't be used for new or expanded fossil fuel projects in any way in line with what the banks are actually committed to themselves. And that kind of work has produced a lot of measurable results. We've seen shareholders over the years really empowered to hold these institutions to account. If you're a shareholder, you own shares in a company, you should have a say in how that company operates. You should be able to vote on the direction that that company takes. It shouldn't just be up to the directors or the board. You own shares, same way with workers. The company cannot function without you, and you should have a say in how that company operates. Over the years, we've really built up that power and seen some big wins for climate and for people. Maybe one of the biggest wins is when CommBank decided to exit thermal coal completely by 2030. Coal is obviously one of the biggest contributors to climate change in the world. It's a dying industry, but an industry that coal companies are very much clinging onto and trying to expand despite the climate crisis. Seeing CommBank agree to phase out thermal coal exposure completely by 2030 was something that the other big four banks then followed suit on. And we've now seen, what is one of the final nails in the coffin of the coal industry, which is not being able to get debt finance from our biggest banks. So it's a huge win. I also did just want to touch on Commonwealth Bank specifically, because they are a part of one of the big wins and big changes we've seen out of this report. So in 2020, we saw 150 shareholders write a letter to Commonwealth Bank, basically demanding explanations for apparent breaches of Commonwealth Bank's own climate policy in regards to oil and gas expansion projects that it was financing. That case ended up going all the way to the federal court. The federal court actually ruled in favor of the shareholders, and then Commonwealth Bank was forced to show the shareholders the assessments it had conducted to finance those projects in the first place. And the result of that is that in 2018, Commonwealth Bank financed about $4 billion to the fossil fuel industry. Last year in 2022, it was down to $267 million. So that's a 92% drop. We've seen historically the biggest financier in the country, mainly due to people power. So these are producing measurable results. And I think a reason I want that to be front of mind is that Commonwealth Bank, despite coming out the best in this report, is just the best of a bad bunch. They have the opportunity to update their policy in August this year, change their climate policy and rule it out once and for all. And if there are CommBank delegates in the room, I definitely want that to be front of mind for you, because your bank has a chance to be a climate leader in this country and to set the tone for the other big four banks. And it could really change the way finance works in this country if they do that. So these are the specifics that we've noted from our report. As you can see there, in the last 2 years, the big four banks have loaned over $13 billion to fossil fuels, and more than half of that, $7.6 billion, has gone to new fossil fuel projects and the companies developing them. That takes us to a total of $57.5 billion, which, whilst it pales in comparison to the American counterparts that April just talked about in her presentation, it is still a shocking amount, considering that that was the time that the world agreed to keep to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that's what they've gone and done since. Science is clear now. There's no room for fossil fuels to stay below 1.5 degrees and reach net zero by 2050. Yet some of our biggest ASX listed companies in the country, Woodside, Whitehaven, Coal, and Santos, are pursuing massive expansion plans that would blow Australia's emissions reduction targets completely out of the water and push us past into an unsafe climate. In terms of the specifics, the key takeaways are that ANZ and NAB have lent the most, and we've identified them as being climate laggards. ANZ, for the most part, is a continuation of its behaviour in the first 5 years since we've been tracking them. NAB was a big shock. Historically had been the third biggest financier. In the last 2 years, it was right up there with ANZ. So to see it regressing at a time when the climate crisis is so bad is really concerning. Westpac lost its position of being the lowest funder of fossil fuels to Commonwealth Bank, who, as I've spoken, has drastically reduced fossil fuel financing, and we attribute that to a big win to people power. And as April said, that's the big loophole enabling fossil fuel expansion, is corporate finance. A lot of the banks will restrict project finance to new coal mines, new oil and gas fields, but they'll hand over corporate finance to Santos, Woodside, and Whitehaven Coal, and they don't have any control over what happens to that money. And if those companies with massive growth plans are seeking that finance, you can guarantee that it is enabling them to go ahead with their growth plans.